Fame can buy mansions, private doctors, the best hospital rooms, and even an entire team ready to rush in when the phone rings. But there is one thing Hollywood never wants to admit. A bacterium so small the human eye cannot see it can still walk through every door that money has locked. It does not ask how many awards you have. It does not care that your name once lit up movie theater marquees. It only needs one tiny opening in the body. I'm not telling this story to scare you for no reason. I'm telling it because it shows a truth that is very hard to hear. Behind the brightest lights, human beings are still fragile in a way no one can act out in front of a camera. And when sepsis begins, time no longer moves slowly. It drops like a stage curtain falling too soon. So how could the icons who once made millions laugh, cry, and believe in magic be defeated by something that began so quietly? Let us begin with the man who built an entire childhood for the world.
Real stories, final moments, lasting echoes. Welcome to The Last Reels.
Number 10. Jim Henson. Jim Henson did not just create puppets. He created an emotional language for millions of children and for adults who once needed a little gentleness in a life that was too loud. The Muppets and Sesame Street were not simply entertainment programs. They were warm rooms where kindness, humor, and imagination were placed at the same table. For many viewers, Jim Henson felt like a permanent part of childhood, a voice that never grew old.
But what makes me choke up is that the man who spent his life helping others understand emotions, understand one another, and understand the world, did not realize that his own body was sending out a dangerous signal. In May 1990, he began feeling like he had the flu, a sore throat, a cough, exhaustion. Things so familiar that many people would do exactly what he did. Rest a little, tell themselves it would probably be fine in a few days, and try not to bother anyone. Trust me, that is the scariest part. There was no alarm bell. There was no chaotic scene at the beginning. It was just a person who worked too hard, who was too used to enduring things, thinking that he simply needed more sleep. But behind that cold-like feeling was a streptococcal infection moving fast. When he was finally taken to the hospital, the bacteria had entered his bloodstream, bringing on toxic shock syndrome and extremely severe sepsis. In just a few days, the man who had recently appeared in public, who was still a living icon in the hearts of audiences, fell into multiple organ failure. Doctors used high-dose antibiotics, trying to win back every hour, every chance. But the inflammatory response inside his body had already moved too quickly. It was like a fire that had spread through the main rooms before the firefighters could arrive in time. It is unbelievable that a sore throat that seemed so small could open the door to tragedy. Jim Henson's death left behind a heartbreaking contradiction. He taught the whole world to listen, but his own body was not listened to in time. And in that silence, Hollywood lost a rare storyteller, while audiences lost a piece of their childhood memory. If his story gives you chills because of a symptom that seems far too ordinary, the next case is even darker because it was covered by the prejudices the public was too quick to believe. Number 9. Jeff Conaway.
When Jeff Conaway appeared in Grease in 1978 as Kenickie, he did not just step onto the screen. He charged into it with a rebellious, sharp, electric energy. Some actors make you remember them through dialogue. Jeff made people remember him through movement, through his eyes, through the feeling that he could set the entire frame on fire just by being there. After that, Taxi brought him deeper into American television life as a face that was both charming and full of ambition. But the second half of Jeff Conaway's life was seen by the public through a harsh lens. His personal problems were repeated again and again, sometimes to the point where people forgot that behind those headlines was still a human being who was tired, hurting, and needed to be seen with more kindness. That is what I find so sad. Hollywood can love you when you are burning bright, but it can also turn your collapse into a show for others to talk about. In May 2011, Jeff was taken to the hospital after being found unconscious. Immediately, the public rushed toward a familiar conclusion, as if they had already prepared the story before the doctors said anything. But the medical truth in his final days was more complicated than that. Jeff had severe pneumonia, especially signs of aspiration pneumonia, a condition that happens when foreign material, such as fluid or other matter, enters the lungs. And from there, his body began sliding down a dangerous slope.
The lungs were not created to handle things like that.
When the respiratory barrier is damaged, bacteria have the chance to take root. An infection located in the lungs may no longer stay in one place. It can awaken an excessive immune response, pushing the entire body into a red alert state. For Jeff, a body already weakened after years of health issues no longer had enough strength to hold on. He was placed in a medically induced coma, but multiple organ failure had begun.
This is truly insane, because the man once remembered for vitality and movement was defeated by a process happening quietly inside his lungs. No final movie scene, no grand line of dialogue, just a chain of silent complications, each link pulling him farther away from the chance to come back. And the most painful part is that the public almost overlooked that medical truth, because they were used to seeing Jeff through the cracks in his private life, rather than through his dignity.
Jeff Conaway reminds me that sometimes tragedy does not only lie in death, but also in the way people are misunderstood before they leave. A secondary infection, an exhausted body, a defense system no longer strong enough, and everything collapses. If that story feels like a stage light slowly fading after years of weariness, the next star shows a different kind of darkness, where the fight against illness itself opened the door to a new danger.
Number 8. Robert Trebor.
For those who loved 1990s fantasy television, Robert Trebor was a very hard face to forget. In Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, and Xena, Warrior Princess, his character Salmoneus always seemed to be running one step ahead of trouble. He talked fast, thought fast, improvised fast, and often brought something very human into a world filled with demigods, warriors, and adventures too large for ordinary life. There was an almost chaotic liveliness in the way he appeared. That character made audiences feel as if Robert Trebor was the kind of person who could always find a way out. No matter what corner he was backed into, he seemed like he would say something clever, slip through a narrow doorway, and survive one more day. But real life does not work like television. And in March 2025, his passing reminded fans that even those who once played the best survivors cannot negotiate with their own biology.
Robert Trebor was being treated for leukemia. And this is the part many outsiders can easily overlook. Treatment for blood cancer is not only a fight against one main disease, it is also a process that places the body in an extremely fragile state. To attack the illness, therapies can weaken the immune system, making the bone marrow and internal protective barriers no longer function the way they once did. In other words, the body is fighting while having its weapons taken away. And sepsis likes exactly that moment. It does not need a large door. It only needs a defense system that has been lowered. In a healthy person, an infection can be contained, controlled, pushed back. But in a severely immunocompromised patient, bacteria can spread before the body has time to build a barrier. When the remaining immune response falls into panic, whole body inflammation begins attacking the very organs that need to be protected.
What is heartbreaking is that in cases like Robert Trebor's, the immediate danger is not always the disease everyone is looking at. Sometimes the final blow comes from a quiet complication that appears while the body is busy fighting a larger enemy. You will not believe it, but a treatment meant to preserve life can also make a patient more vulnerable to very ordinary bacteria in everyday life. Robert Trebor's story is not a story about weakness. It is a story about the harsh cost of modern medical battles. A man who once brought laughter to a fantasy world was ultimately pulled into a cold reality where every cell could become a front line. And if you think Hollywood is only powerless against serious illness, the next case proves something even more frightening. Privilege and elegance are not armor either. Number 7. Christopher Cazenove. Christopher Cazenove carried the kind of presence that Hollywood and British television always loved. He had a calm, elegant appearance, almost as if he had been born to stand in grand rooms, wear perfect suits, and say things that made others listen. From the Duchess of Duke Street to his role as Ben Carrington in Dynasty, he often appeared as a gentleman in control, a man surrounded by status, wealth, and refinement. And that is exactly what makes his final weeks harder to accept. In early 2010, after returning to London from a trip to California, Christopher began feeling unwell. That was all. There was no fateful fall at the very beginning. There was no clear sign that forced people to call it a disaster. At first, it only seemed like a vague condition, a body saying that something was not right, but not yet speaking in a language loud enough. Then everything sped up. He collapsed and was taken to St. Thomas's Hospital. There, doctors identified the real problem as sepsis. This is one of the things that makes this illness so chilling to me. We often think a severe infection must come from a complex surgery, an obvious wound, or a medical situation that is easy to recognize. But sometimes the entry point for bacteria is almost invisible to outsiders, even to the patient himself.
This meticulously curated mythology fractured abruptly when explosive rumors of a hidden life exposed a deeply buried chapter of his past. A devastating media frenzy ignited as singer Brandon Howard emerged from the shadows, thrusting a decades-old secret into the glaring spotlight of modern tabloids. The world collectively held its breath when an entertainment outlet leaked a shocking DNA test, broadcasting claims of a 99.999% genetic match to a ravenous public.
He spent weeks in intensive care. Think about that contrast. A man who once appeared on screen with absolute control ended up lying among the sounds of machines, 5 lines, and a heartbeat monitored minute by minute, while inside his body there was an invisible biological uprising. It was surprising, but also cruel. External refinement could not protect the internal structure once the infection had crossed the line. Christopher Cazenove left behind a hard lesson for anyone who has ever believed that money, good care, or status can keep risk far away forever. Some things do not negotiate with privilege. Some things need only one tiny breach to take away all the invulnerability that others see. And from that broken elegance, we move to a story even more painful, because the next victim was only a child. Number 6. Heather O'Rourke. For audiences of the 1980s, Heather O'Rourke was the small face standing in the middle of a cinematic nightmare. In the Poltergeist film series, her innocence created a contrast that viewers could not look away from. She did not need to scream too much to make the frame haunting. Just those eyes, that hair, and the very real fragility of childhood made Heather a child icon in American horror. But in real life, Heather's tragedy was more frightening than any supernatural story Hollywood ever built around her. She died when she was only 12 years old, and for many years that death was often pulled into rumors, stories about a curse, things that sounded fascinating in the press, but obscured the most important part, the medical truth. What really happened was not a mystical mystery. It was a chain of errors, misdiagnosis, and collapse that happened too fast.
A year before her death, Heather was misdiagnosed with Crohn's disease and treated in that direction. But the real problem lay in a congenital structural condition, acute intestinal stenosis. She may have been living with that narrowing inside her body without anyone realizing it. And that is what makes this story so painful. Sometimes a child's body still compensates, still tries to function, still maintains a normal enough appearance long enough that adults do not see the full crisis forming.
In early 1988, Heather's first symptoms looked like an ordinary digestive problem. A stomachache, a feeling like a childhood illness. But inside, the narrowed intestine had become blocked and ruptured. When that happened, bacteria were released into the bloodstream, creating septic shock. Oh my God, just reading this far is enough to make your heart feel heavy. An illness that seemed ordinary had hidden a serious biological fracture.
On the way to the hospital, Heather went into cardiac arrest. Surgeons later handled the intestinal obstruction, but the sepsis had already gone too far. The whole body inflammatory response had triggered a chain of damage that medicine could not reverse in time. That is the part that hurts the most. Sometimes doctors can fix the broken door, but they cannot stop the storm that has already flooded the entire house. Heather O'Rourke is not just a name on a list of Hollywood tragedies. She is a reminder that children do not always show danger in the way adults expect. The body's silence is not always safety. Sometimes it is only the storm waiting for the right second to show itself. If Heather's death makes you feel the fragility of childhood in a suffocating way, the next story shows another kind of quiet collapse in someone who spent his life being a steady presence on screen. Number 5. Charlie Robinson. Charlie Robinson was not the kind of actor who always needed to stand at the center to command the frame. In Night Court, as Mac, he was a steady presence in the middle of a chaotic comic world. When the other characters spun like a whirlwind, he kept the rhythm. He had a calm, warm, trustworthy quality, as if the moment he appeared, the room instantly had a foundation. He was the kind of actor audiences might not name first, but always felt was missing when he was gone. Charlie Robinson's career lasted about 50 years across television and theater. He was someone who made a scene stand firm, not just someone who delivered lines. And because that image was so stable, the news that he died in July 2021 at a hospital in Los Angeles left many people feeling a loss. Not because the public did not know he had health problems. He was facing metastatic adenocarcinoma. But the medical ending had a darker layer. In the end, septic shock was the factor that caused his body's systems to collapse. This is the part many people often misunderstand. When someone is fighting cancer, the public tends to think the main disease is the whole story. But in reality, cancer and complex treatments can gradually drain the immune system. The body has to use too much energy just to maintain basic defenses. And when a secondary infection appears, it can break through the barrier very quickly. For Charlie, sepsis led to multiple organ failure and ultimately cardiac arrest. Imagine a system that had been under pressure for a long time, then suddenly had to fight another attack from within. The body does not always lose because of the biggest enemy. Sometimes it loses because the final blow comes from a smaller, less noticed direction. This sounds cold, but that is exactly how sepsis can act. I think what makes Charlie's story haunting is the contrast between image and reality. On screen, he brought a sense of balance. In real life, his own body lost balance in an immune crisis that was too strong. The man who once made viewers feel reassured
ultimately fell into a condition where even the medical team had to race against every change happening inside him. It was not as loud as a scandal, but it was cruel in its own way. Charlie Robinson reminds us that people being treated for serious illness should not be seen only through the name of the main disease. They also have to live with hundreds of smaller risks around them, risks that can become enormous in a short time. And if the story is already heavy enough, the next case is shocking in a different way. A young star standing right at the threshold of global glory, then disappearing within only a few hours. Number 4. Charlbi Dean. Charlbi Dean did not leave at the end of a career that had closed. She left when the biggest door had just opened. At 32, she was stepping into the moment any young actor would dream of. Triangle of Sadness had just won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, and her name was beginning to be mentioned as a face that could go much further on the international film map. She was not a legend looking back at the past. Charlbi was a future still glowing. And because of that, her death in August 2022 stunned people. At first, she felt unwell with symptoms that sounded almost not frightening: a headache, body aches. She went to an emergency room in New York. Then, within only a few hours, she died. You know that is the kind of timeline the public cannot understand. How could a young, beautiful, rising person, someone who had just been at the center of a major film success, disappear so quickly? The medical findings later revealed a detail that made the story feel chilling. Charlbi had sepsis caused by capnocytophagia, a type of bacteria commonly found in the mouths of dogs and cats. For most people, it rarely causes anything serious, but Charlbi had a weakness few outsiders knew about. Many years earlier, she survived a serious car accident. To save her life, doctors had to remove her spleen. The spleen is not an organ the public usually thinks about when talking about health, but it plays an important role as a filter in the immune system, especially in dealing with certain types of bacteria. Without a spleen, the body loses an important layer of protection. The surgery that once kept Charlbi alive also left a small, unlocked door inside her defense system. And years later, an ordinary bacterium found that exact door. This truly gives me chills. An old injury, a surgery that saved her life, a silent weakness that existed for more than a decade, then one bacterial exposure enough to push the body into sepsis. There was no time for the public to prepare. There was no long story for fans to gradually accept. There was only a rising star, one day of feeling unwell, and then a silence that was far too sudden. Charlbi Dean shows that sepsis does not only target older people or those who appear weak. It can exploit old injuries that outsiders never see. A person can look healthy, active, radiant, and still carry inside their body a small vulnerability large enough to change fate. If Charlbi's passing feels like a film cut off in the middle of its opening scene, the next star was a monument who seemed impossible to knock down. Number 3. Brian Dennehy. Brian Dennehy entered every movie scene like a talking wall. Tall, powerful, with a voice and posture that immediately made people pay attention. He did not need to show off to create pressure. In First Blood, his role as Sheriff Teasel carried its own kind of weight. On the Broadway stage, when he became Willy Loman, he proved that such a massive body could also contain the collapse of a soul. Brian did not just act, he occupied space. For more than 50 years, he was often cast in roles that felt unshakable. That is why the news that he died in April 2020 felt instinctively hard for many people to believe. Brian Dennehy seemed like someone whose body would fight until the end. But this is exactly the illusion that sepsis breaks in the cruelest way. It does not care how strong you look. It does not see height, shoulders, or a lifetime of endurance. It fights at the cellular level. The direct cause was described as sudden cardiac arrest, but behind that stoppage was severe sepsis. Because his death happened during the early chaotic period of global lockdowns, his representative clarified that it was not related to the pandemic that was going on. However, the specific source of infection was not publicly disclosed. And on a human level, perhaps that lack of clarity is what makes the story even more haunting. Once sepsis has started, the beginning point is sometimes no longer the scariest thing. The scary thing is the chain reaction. Infection enters the system. The body responds with an overly strong inflammatory reaction, and then that reaction itself begins damaging blood vessels, organs, and the heart. For Brian, the heart ultimately had to bear pressure it could no longer continue under. A man who once appeared as a symbol of durability was ultimately pulled down by the biological system inside him. It is unbelievable, but body size sometimes only creates a sense of safety for those looking from the outside. It does not guarantee that the inside cannot collapse. Brian Dennehy is a painful proof of that. Hollywood once loved his strength, but sepsis did not confront that outer image. It went straight to the foundation, and when the foundation shakes, even a monument can fall in silence. Brian's story makes me think a lot about the way we judge people by what we see. We call someone healthy, strong, unbeatable. But the human body is never that simple. Behind an imposing frame is still a system that must stay balanced every second. And if you think media confusion was already heartbreaking, the next story is even more surreal, because the whole world once heard that she had died, then had not died, and then had truly died. Number 2. Tanya Roberts. Tanya Roberts lived in two very different areas of pop culture memory. For one generation, she was the allure of the late 1970s, connected to Charlie's Angels and the tense world of James Bond. For another generation, she was Midge Pinciati in That 70s Show, a familiar, gentle, lively face in a beloved sitcom. Tanya had the kind of presence that made viewers feel as if they had known her for a very long time. But her final days were covered by a strange kind of chaos. In early 2021, when Tanya was hospitalized, news about her condition turned into an unbelievable spiral. Her death was announced, then retracted, and finally confirmed within a confusing 48 hours. Oh my God. That confusion alone was enough to stun fans. But what was even sadder was that all that noise almost buried the real medical cause. On Christmas Eve, Tanya was simply walking her dog when she suddenly collapsed. It was not a dramatic event like in a movie. It was not a grand accident. It was just an ordinary moment, a normal action millions of people do every day. But from there, everything opened in a direction no one expected. The root cause was not a rare disease or a sudden heart event. It was a urinary tract infection. And this is the part that makes Tanya's story frightening enough that many people should pay attention. Urinary tract infections are very common. Many people see them as a small inconvenience, a problem that can be handled with medicine and rest. But if bacteria are not detected or controlled in time, they can spread up to the kidneys and then enter the bloodstream. Once they cross that threshold, the story is no longer a simple infection. It can become sepsis. In Tanya's case, severe sepsis began affecting major organs, including the liver and gallbladder. Think about that contrast. A woman who once represented glamour on screen, who had been a symbol of liveliness, was ultimately brought down by a condition many people still think of as minor. That is not only shocking, it also forces us to reconsider how we judge the very ordinary signals of the body. Tanya Roberts left behind a direct reminder that not every danger appears with a frightening face. Sometimes it begins with something too familiar, too everyday, so we overlook it. And during those messy 48 hours in the media, a heartbreaking truth sank beneath the noise. The human body can move from stable to critical so quickly that outsiders do not have time to understand what happened. If Tanya's story is a butterfly effect from a common infection, the final figure takes us to an even deeper tragedy, because she spent her life learning how to control her own pain. Number 1. Patty Duke. Patty Duke was the kind of star Hollywood loved to turn into an icon very early. At 16, she won an Oscar for The Miracle Worker, an enormous achievement for a young girl. After that, her cheerful image in a 1960s sitcom made her a familiar face in American households. But if we remember Patty Duke only through awards and television lights, we miss the most important part of her life. Outside the camera, Patty fought years of internal chaos. After being diagnosed with bipolar disorder in middle age, she did not choose silence. She became one of the first major celebrities to speak publicly about mental health, helping pull a subject that had once been hidden out of the darkness. That, to me, is even stronger than any role. She used her own story to make other people feel less alone. And that is why Patty Duke's passing in 2016 felt especially unfair. A woman who had learned to monitor herself, name her pain, seek help, and reclaim control of her life was ultimately defeated by a physical complication that moved too fast. She had severe abdominal pain. The problem was identified as a ruptured intestine, a serious emergency condition. But the real danger did not lie only in that rupture. When the intestine ruptures, bacteria can escape and enter the bloodstream. The body responds by activating the immune system. But in sepsis, that response is no longer controlled. It is like a defense system firing in every direction, trying to save the house, but burning the walls at the same time. Healthy organs begin to be affected. The timeline shrinks. What people think is a localized emergency quickly becomes a full-body crisis. Patty Duke died after sepsis overwhelmed her system. And what haunts me is the contrast. She had survived long psychological battles, had turned personal experience into a voice for the community, had proven that human beings can learn to live with darkness. But sepsis does not care about that resilience. It does not check your past. It does not say that because you have suffered enough, it will spare you. Patty Duke reminds me that some tragedies do not come because people lack strength. They come because the body is sometimes more fragile than the will. A person can be mentally strong, brave in front of public opinion, survive years of pain, and still need protection from very real physical signs. That is the biggest lesson in today's entire story. Fame cannot always save you. Resilience cannot replace timely medical care. Looking back at these 10 stories, I see a cold thread running through all of them. Jim Henson began with something that felt like the flu. Jeff Conaway was misread through the lens of his private life. Robert Trebor fought leukemia while his immune system was weakened. Christopher Cazenove had every external advantage, but still could not stop an internal crisis. Heather O'Rourke was a child hidden behind a misdiagnosis. Charlie Robinson showed that serious illness can open the door to quiet complications. Charlbi Dean reminds us that youth and radiance are not absolute protection. Brian Dennehy broke the illusion that a large body means invincibility. Tanya Roberts showed that a common infection can become a tragedy if it moves beyond control. And Patty Duke, perhaps most heartbreakingly, showed that even someone who learned to survive inner darkness can still be struck down by a biological reaction that moves too fast.
What I want to keep after this video is not only sadness, it is awareness. Our bodies are always speaking, even when they only whisper. An unusual pain, lasting fatigue, an infection that does not improve, a symptom that seems small but becomes unusual, all of it deserves to be listened to. Do not turn endurance into courage. Do not be afraid to seek help just because you are scared of bothering someone. Health is not something to gamble with silence. And for Hollywood, these stories are also a more human reminder. Behind every icon is a real body, a real family, a real pain. We can love the roles, remember the films, talk about the glorious moments, but please do not forget to see them as human beings. No one is only a headline. No one is only one sad final scene. They lived, worked, and made audiences feel less alone for a certain period of time. If today's story made you think, please hit like to support this video. Subscribe to The Last Reels and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss the next stories behind Hollywood's glow. Leave a comment and let me know which person on this list moved you the most, or which star you have always loved over the years. Thank you, everyone, for staying until the end of the video. Take care of yourself, listen to your body, and I will see you again in the next final Reels.